Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, wherever you are in the world. I hope this finds you well. Today we're going to be looking at the S&P 500 and try to ascertain whether or not there is any alpha in correlating the S&P 500 to Bitcoin market cycles. So I have pulled up the S&P 500 and the Bitcoin chart side by side. And I want to just do a little comparison to see if there's any credibility to the idea that the Bitcoin cycles are also correlated with price action on the US stock market. So many of us look at the Bitcoin halving as an indication of future price action and timing of the market cycle. But what if we also look at the S&P 500 as one example, the US stock market, to kind of get a feel for where Bitcoin could be headed? So one thing that I want to point out, like if we go and look at the S&P 500 and we look at peaks and breakouts, what was Bitcoin doing? So coming back here to, for example, 2011, what happened here? So basically, it broke out, it back tested a few times, and then it broke higher. You can see Bitcoin, this correlated. Maybe it's just a fluke, maybe it's just a fluke that Bitcoin really started pumping once the S&P 500 broke out. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to just highlight all these moments on the S&P 500. And so we have all of these moments highlighted here. And we'll highlight these areas where maybe the S&P 500 was in an accumulation. And we'll see what Bitcoin was doing during that time. We could also maybe say that it was accumulating there. So here we have Bitcoin essentially peaking when the S&P 500 was going sideways for quite a while. Here we have the S&P 500 going sideways between 2014, 2015, and 2016 before it really started breaking out. And Bitcoin was basically putting in its bottom here. So similarly, the S&P 500 put in a peak here and then went sideways. Bitcoin put in its peak also, and then Bitcoin went down a lot more than the stock market. The stock market was, you could say, sideways. It also was very volatile, but it even put in a new high here while Bitcoin just kind of dumped. And this big drop caused a big drop in Bitcoin, right? And then Bitcoin really started breaking out when the S&P 500 broke out and never came back down to backtest any previous levels. Similarly here, Bitcoin put in its peak when the S&P 500 peaked. The S&P 500 went into a big cup and handle. Bitcoin did its thing, big Wyckoff accumulation range. And now, interestingly enough, the S&P 500 is breaking out again. Bitcoin is breaking out again. And the thing about this cycle is that the Bitcoin halving has come in at the all-time highs. For Bitcoin price was at the all-time highs when the halving came in April. of 2024. And so the S&P 500 is also breaking out. So it begs the question, what causes Bitcoin to break out to new all-time highs, to reach new valuations? Is it the halving, or is it the US stock market and just the overall global flow of liquidity? I mean, I think both are important, but I think that some might be underweighting the importance of the global flow of liquidity and the stock market as well. So this video is really just to highlight that during these phases, Bitcoin is affected by what the stock market does. I think that it's important to look at. And then another interesting thing, for example, I believe it was on this, where did the S&P 500 peak? If we come in and we look at this range, S&P 500 essentially peaked at the 4.236. And once that happened, once it even got above the 3.618, people probably started de-risking. Bitcoin sold off. Bitcoin peaked. Let's see if there's any other correlations on this as well. So if we take this range and we come up to the 618, we got very close to the 3.618 and the 4.236 on the stock market. Bitcoin put in its peak right here when it was almost at the 3.618 drawn this way. If we look at it here, it was basically hitting the 4.236 here, and that is actually more or less where Bitcoin peaked on this cycle. You just move them around, you look at as many different possibilities and see what the effect is. So what I am curious now about is on this range for the S&P 500, 3.618, 4.236 would correlate with 7,800 and 8,600 roughly, which, if the stock market continues up to those valuations, to those levels, theoretically, Bitcoin could also be continuing higher until that time. The S&P 500 could fall short, it could go sideways, but, sometimes in hindsight, the swings don't look as big. I'm sure during this time, when the S&P 500 was around 2,000, for example, I'm sure that this level right here, the 4.236, looked a lot higher than it does now. And I'm sure people probably couldn't imagine this scenario necessarily playing out right here. I'm sure people probably were expecting downward price action in here. I do remember in 2017, someone much more experienced in the markets and much older than me, 2017 was thinking we were going into a bear market. I remember distinctly in 2017, they thought we were going into a bear market, but instead the S&P 500, for example, continued higher. Stock market basically just ranged for a bit sideways. And yeah, it wasn't exciting, but it definitely wasn't like a major problem if you had a long-term time horizon. So the point of this video anyway is just to say that the S&P 500 is important. So we should take that into consideration when we look at what Bitcoin can do in the future. If you like the content, make sure you like and subscribe, and leave a comment. Let me know how this resonated with you, and if you'd like to see more videos on the stock market.